Dr. Michael Harrison, a middle-aged doctor with years of experience, strode confidently into the hospital room. His crisp white coat swayed behind him, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the quiet room. He hardly glanced at Emma Turner, the tired black nurse who was adjusting an 4-line for an elderly man lying in the bed. Emma had been working long hours and her face showed signs of exhaustion. She was focused on her patient, a frail, old man, and she was doing her best to make him comfortable. But Dr. Harrison didn't seem to notice. With a sharp tone, he snapped, "Didn't I tell you to let the attending handle this? You're just a nurse." Emma's hands trembled slightly as she worked, but she bit her tongue. She had been here before. Years of working in the hospital had taught her that sometimes, people like Dr. Harrison would look down on her, treating her as if she were less important than the doctors. The humiliation stung, but she kept her focus on the patient, making sure the 4 was correctly adjusted. Keanu, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room, watched the exchange with growing discomfort. He had seen this kind of behavior before. He recognized the sharp, dismissive tone, the kind of cruelty that was often hidden behind a professional front. He knew what it felt like to be treated like you weren't good enough, to be judged by the color of your skin or the title on your badge. Keanu's eyes darkened as he waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't help but feel that something important was about to happen. Then the old man in the bed, who had been lying still, suddenly let out a weak chuckle. His voice was raspy, but it carried a sense of familiarity. "Son, is that how you talk to the people keeping you alive, Dr. Harrison?" The doctor froze. His eyes widened, and for the first time he seemed genuinely shocked. Emma gasped quietly, her hands still on the 4-line. Keanu, who had been quietly observing, felt his heart race. The frail man lying in the bed wasn't just any old patient. He was someone no one expected. Dr. Harrison's face drained of color as he looked down at the elderly man. The old man slowly turned his head, his tired eyes locking onto Dr. Harrison's. A slow, knowing smile crept across the man's lips, as though he had been waiting for this moment. Emma stood frozen, gripping the 4-stand for support. The room seemed to grow still and quiet, like time itself had stopped. Keanu shifted in his seat, watching the scene unfold. His heart was pounding, not just from the recognition of the old man, but because he knew that something important was happening. The air in the room felt thick with tension. Dr. Harrison tried to speak but found himself at a loss for words. The old man exhaled slowly, and his voice, though faint and weak, carried a sense of power. "All my life," the old man murmured, his voice barely audible, "I've watched men like you dismiss people like her." He gestured toward Emma, who stood motionless. Her eyes were filled with unspoken emotions, the weight of years of being treated as less than others. The old man's words hung in the air, as if they were a challenge to Dr. Harrison. "You think a title makes you superior," the old man continued. "But let me ask you, doctor, what happens when the person you look down on is the only one standing between you and your last breath?" Emma blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. She had spent years enduring moments like this. Moments where her knowledge, her skill, and her dedication had been overshadowed by the color of her skin or the title of the person she worked with. But this time felt different. This time someone was watching. Someone understood. Keanu, who had been silently observing, finally spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "Maybe you should listen," he said softly. His gaze was steady on Dr. Harrison, and the doctor could feel the weight of his words. Dr. Harrison's throat tightened. He looked at Keanu, his eyes narrowing as realization slowly began to dawn on him. The actor's words, spoken with such quiet authority, seemed to penetrate the walls Dr. Harrison had built around himself. He felt uneasy, unsettled by the moment. Emma took a shaky breath and gently spoke to the elderly man. "Let's get you comfortable," she said softly, pushing past the lump in her throat. Her hands moved with practiced care, adjusting the patient's blanket and ensuring he was as comfortable as possible. The old man chuckled softly, his voice rasping but warm. "Funny thing about life," he said, staring at the ceiling, "you never know who's watching or who you're talking to." Dr. Harrison's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Keanu shifted in his seat, his voice breaking the silence once again. "You speak like a man who's seen a lot," he said quietly. The old man smiled faintly, his lips cracking slightly at the edges. "Oh, I've seen more than most," the old man replied, his gaze flickering back to Dr. Harrison. "Tell me, doctor, do you remember all the names of the nurses who have saved your patients?" Dr. Harrison's mouth went dry. He parted his lips but couldn't speak. He looked briefly at Emma, but he quickly lowered his gaze, ashamed. Emma exhaled a slow, steady breath, her heart racing. She had spent years in this hospital, working hard, doing her best, but never being truly seen. Now at this moment she wasn't ignored. She wasn't invisible. The silence stretched on and it felt heavy. Finally, Keanu spoke again, his voice calm but filled with meaning. "Sometimes," he said softly, "you don't realize the weight of your actions until you see them through someone else's eyes." Dr. Harrison inhaled sharply, the realization sinking in like a heavy stone in his chest. He had treated Emma badly. He had spoken to her as if she didn't matter, as if she were just another person to be dismissed. But now, in this moment, with the weight of the old man's words and Keanu's quiet authority bearing down on him, Dr. Harrison saw himself clearly. And for the first time in his life, he didn't like what he saw. Emma adjusted the patient's blanket, her fingers moving with gentle precision. The old man's breathing steadied, and his eyes fluttered closed for a moment, as if he was drifting off to sleep. But then he opened them again and whispered in a faint voice, "You never know who's listening and you never know who you're speaking to." Keanu nodded in quiet understanding. He had spent years in the public eye, but he had also known what it felt like to be overlooked, to be underestimated. He had seen both kindness and cruelty in his life, and tonight, he had witnessed something that made him feel a deep respect for the old man and Emma. This was a moment of reckoning for Dr. Harrison, a moment where he had to confront his own actions. Dr. Harrison stood frozen, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, to explain why he had acted the way he had. But for the first time he realized there was nothing he could say. The words felt empty. Emma didn't need an apology. She had spent her entire life proving her worth through her actions, not through words. She had earned her place even if others couldn't see it. Without waiting for an apology, Emma met Dr. Harrison's gaze. Her eyes were steady, unwavering. She didn't need to say anything. She simply turned back to her patient and resumed her work. Keanu watched her, his admiration for her growing with every passing second. At that moment, Emma Turner wasn't just a nurse. She was a force. And Dr. Harrison was only just beginning to understand what that meant. The hum of medical machines filled the room, the rhythmic beeping echoing through the silence. Emma moved with care, adjusting the floor and making sure the elderly man was as comfortable as possible. She had done this 1,000 times before, for patients who barely remembered her name, for doctors who didn't acknowledge her presence. But tonight was different. Tonight she wasn't invisible. Dr. Harrison stood still, his fists clenched at his sides. The weight of his own arrogance pressed down on him, heavier than the white coat he wore. For years he had prided himself on his knowledge, his years of experience, and his title. But none of that mattered now. In this moment, under the watchful eyes of Keanu Reeves and the elderly man in the bed, Dr. Harrison saw himself clearly for the first time. And he didn't like what he saw. Keanu watched the man, his face hard to read. Keanu was quiet, but his presence was strong. There was something about his eyes that made you feel like he had lived through a lot, like he knew deep sadness but also understood life. He wasn't just looking at the man, he was remembering something important. Emma took a deep breath. She had to focus. The patient, the old man who spoke so wisely and with such calm power, needed her. That's what mattered now. Not the way she had been hurt in the past or how she had been ignored, but this moment. The old man slowly let out a breath and opened his eyes again. He looked at Keanu. "I've seen you before," he said quietly. Keanu smiled a little. "It happens sometimes," he said softly. The old man looked at him for a long time, thinking hard. "Not in movies," he said. "Somewhere else." Emma paused for a moment, then went back to taking care of the patient. She looked at Keanu, wondering what he would say next. Keanu tilted his head, a small and mysterious look in his eyes. "Maybe," he said simply. The old man laughed, but it sounded weak. "Life's funny like that," he said. "Sometimes people meet for a reason." Dr. Harrison, who had been standing quietly, shifted uncomfortably. He was a doctor, a man of science who trusted facts and logic. But this moment, this strange and quiet feeling in the room, was something he didn't understand. Emma finished adjusting the floor, then stepped back. She folded her hands together, trying to stay calm. Then, for the first time that night, Dr. Harrison spoke. His voice wasn't strong like usual, not full of power, but quiet and unsure. "I was wrong," he whispered. Emma turned to look at him. She had waited a long time to hear these words from people like him, but now that he said them, she didn't need them as much as she thought she would. She had always known she was important. The real question was if Dr. Harrison was ready to face the truth about himself. Keanu leaned back in his chair, breathing out slowly. He had seen moments like this before when people were standing on the edge of change, unsure of who they used to be or who they could become. At that moment, Keanu knew one thing for sure. The real story wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. The room felt heavier now, not just because of the quiet words that were left unsaid, but because something bigger was happening. Emma stood still, her hands clenched tightly together. Her heart was racing, but she stayed calm. Dr. Harrison's words hung in the air, fragile but strong, like something new was about to happen. "I was wrong," he had said. Emma had heard people apologize before, but most of the time, those apologies didn't feel real. But when Dr. Harrison said it, it was different. His voice was full of pain, like admitting it was hard for him. That made her stop and think. Keanu leaned forward, his sharp eyes on Dr. Harrison. He watched him like someone watching a story that isn't finished yet, waiting to see how it would turn out. The old man, still in bed, let out a weak laugh. "Son," he said, his voice soft like paper, "realizing you're wrong is just the start. The real work starts after." Dr. Harrison clenched his hands, his knuckles going white. For the first time in years, he felt exposed, not like a doctor or someone in charge, but like a regular person who had been blind to what was really important. Emma turned back to the patient and carefully adjusted his blanket as she always did, but something about tonight felt different. The old man slowly turned his head and looked at Emma. His eyes were fading, but he still managed a weak smile. "You remind me of someone," he whispered. Emma paused. "Who?" she asked quietly. The old man breathed in sharply, like he was remembering something from long ago. "My wife," he said, his voice shaking. "She was a nurse just like you." Emma's heart ached as he spoke. "She used to tell me," the old man continued, "that real strength isn't in power. It's in kindness." His eyes looked over at Dr. Harrison, who stood frozen. "I never understood what she meant until now." Keanu exhaled deeply, his eyes understanding. He had seen moments like this before, when people finally saw themselves clearly, when regret and understanding met. The beeping of the monitors slowed, and the air in the room seemed colder. Emma felt a tear slip down her cheek. The old man's eyes fluttered, and his grip on the blanket loosened. "She's waiting for me," he whispered, mostly to himself. Emma's heart broke as she whispered, "You're not alone." The old man smiled a little, a peaceful smile, and then he sighed quietly. He was gone. The beeping of the monitors stopped with a steady tone. Dr. Harrison took a step back, his breath shaky. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, clenching his jaw. Emma's hands shook, but she didn't move away. Instead, she gently placed her hand on the old man's cold hand. The room was silent for a long time. Slowly, Keanu stood up and walked over to Emma. He spoke softly but firmly. "He saw you. Really saw you." Emma breathed out, nodding, but her chest hurt with a feeling she couldn't explain. Dr. Harrison took a slow step forward. His face was pale, his hands shaking. He looked around the room at the monitors that no longer beeped, at Emma, and at the old man. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a doctor. He just felt like a man. A man who had finally understood something important. His throat felt tight, and when he spoke, his voice was small. "What do I do now?" Emma turned to him, her eyes red but steady. "Be better," she whispered. For the first time, Dr. Harrison didn't argue. He just nodded. And as Keanu placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder, the room felt heavy with something that couldn't be explained. One thing was clear. This night had changed them all forever. If you like this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling adventures, mysteries, and unforgettable moments. Your support keeps these stories alive and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching. I can't wait to see you in the next video.